The real China, pre-communist China, well, they're continuing that tradition. They fought because they refused to become. They didn't want to bring communism into their country. This is precisely how it is. It's comparable to how Ukraine, at one point in its history, Ukraine once engaged in conflict with the Bolsheviks. So for most people, those who don't delve deep, or rather have superficial knowledge, they don't even know history. They believe that at some point Ukrainians, Kazakhs and Tajiks simply awakened and desired to join a non-existent, universally unknown Soviet Union, governed by novel rules that were completely unfamiliar and had never been practically tested anywhere. Ukraine fought against the Bolsheviks, despite having recently been a part of the Russian Empire. Taiwan has always fought for its own world order. And as practice shows, Taiwan is a much more interesting place to live, its economy is more interesting, and its social policy is more interesting. And China naturally desires to reclaim it, both for economic reasons and once more to avoid establishing a precedent, as you rightly point out, where a part of our territory was simply seized and separated. So these are the Chinese people who just don't want to live according to communist rules.
But under international law, Taiwan is China's territory. Even the US recognizes that. So, and let's be honest, today's China is most likely communist China. Well, let's put it this way. Okay, communist China, hypothetically, although I don't truly consider it communist.
It is not truly communist, it is only communist on the cover. In fact, it's essentially state nomenclatura capitalism. A place where the economy actually functions. And Russia is, in essence, a comparable situation. But to me, communist China is like the Soviet Union, but it's a Soviet Union that seems to be implementing things correctly for the long term. However, in the long run, it simply isn't going to work. But at least they realize that with this whole idea of we'll make everyone work 18 hours and the economy will grow, the money still needs to be reinvested, put back into the economy's circulation. In Russia, the money is taken by a certain top, the elite, a certain group of people. It doesn't return to the economy, and that's where the problems start. And then you have to create an external enemy to explain where the money is going. We're at war, constantly saving someone.
I get what you mean, but still, China right now has more of a claim to China itself because it's just, located on the territory of China. Because, China is much bigger than Taiwan.
Well, just by size.
Yes, and honestly, when considering their size and economy, Taiwan isn't entirely self-sufficient in one crucial area. However, it holds a leading and quite significant position in microelectronics, particularly microprocessors. But in everything else, China has proven its viability, at least economically. It lifted millions of Chinese people out of poverty. Yes, it isn't entirely communist, but it is, at the very least, what I would characterize as a social state. Because in China, I was in China a long time ago when I was just a kid. But for some reason, it's deeply ingrained in my memory that China is absolutely the country of the future, because over there. Well, I can't explain why, but it's just etched in my memory from childhood for some reason. When I found myself in China, I was like, oh, this isn't Russia. This is a totally different world, really.
I don't know, perhaps for those of you from Russia, having arrived in China, it may appear more acceptable. But from the viewpoint of free nations, China seems like an utterly totalitarian, authoritarian state that frankly holds no regard for human life. And it's precisely because of this that people, like small cogs, are constantly spinning and driving this economy forward. By the way, communist China is currently in a major decline. Its economy is already starting to downtrend, facing an economic downturn. And it is also very heavily reliant on America as its most important partner. Well, to put it another way, to truly exist effectively in the modern world, one needs to be globalized, collaborating and interacting with the world at large. And to cooperate while at the same time building a great wall, metaphorically speaking, it's a little illogical. Again, it's very large, and because of that, there's a lack of coordination. To put it more accurately, one hand doesn't quite perceive what the other is doing. But in the long run, this isn't a very viable option either. A viable, so to speak, format for existence.
Am I understanding correctly that you don't believe that, socialism, communism, let's say socialism is the next stage of, so to speak, human evolution? I take it you don't think so. You believe that capitalism is the point where our human history should, metaphorically speaking, come to a halt. So, if I understand correctly, you're not granting China the right to exist, not a right to exist, but you are predicting that China will alter its communist policy, collapse, and so forth, merely for having these socialist inclinations.
That's an excellent question. I've actually spent about 3 months searching for someone with whom I could delve into this discussion. That's just it. I was once very interested in all of this, and I even read up on it and delved deep into anarchism. I felt that anarchism represented the ultimate phase of societal evolution. That is to say,
it really is.
Self-regulation, exactly. I was just judging based on my own experience. I mean, the entire philosophy of anarchism is founded on the principle that the maxim of my action should be such that if every other individual were to act similarly, then, generally speaking, everything would be absolutely perfect. Well, to put it simply, it all stems from the Christian principle: treat others as you would want to be treated yourself. And when every single moment of your existence is regulated by this very principle, you park your car somewhere, step out, and then you ponder, what if a woman with a baby stroller wants to pass here but is unable to?
And you wouldn't even need a government in place to look after it.
Right. I thought that was the future, but we won't deal with any nuances here. To truly grasp if lines are parallel or not, you have to exaggerate them, stretching them out indefinitely to see if they eventually meet. So let's take, for instance, let's just say, hypothetically, and we'll exaggerate it, there are people who are born with mental illnesses. Let's not even talk about people with weak discipline or those who are gambling addicts or drug addicts. This is in principle biology. It's all essentially the same thing, truly. It is an inability, a lack of coordination between different regions of the brain. And so, if a person is born with conditions like schizophasia, schizophrenia, or other illnesses, and they are incapable of controlling themselves, then it becomes necessary for us to control them. But then the crucial question arises, where exactly do we draw that boundary? Are we obligated to control a schizophrenic? And what about someone with schizophasia? Where precisely is that line drawn? And it turns out that the very biology of humans themselves is human imperfection. It doesn't allow for a society where each individual unit is self-regulating. Although that's a utopia, I believe it's quite grand. And I understand that it's ideal, but it's only ideal on paper, not in reality. So everything reverts. Capitalism is equivalent to natural selection. Correct? Only the strongest survive. It is an absolutely animalistic primal system. But the point is, we are truly animals. And it's bad, but nothing better exists. And so far we haven't been able to devise anything. And socialism gives rise to things like a planned economy. And with a planned economy lacking both incentive and competition, there is no progress or development for anyone. And China, just like the Arab Emirates, experienced significant development not because they started innovating, but because they possess a substantial. They have one key resource, and they convert it into technologies they got from the Western world. Perhaps they're manufacturing their own products now, but it's still not quite the same. For instance, even small Taiwan produces chips that America itself cannot manufacture in such large volumes. But China can't do that because of the planned economy and in the Soviet.
China can do a lot. It's not that strong in microprocessors. Let's just skip microprocessors, as I'm not an expert on them.
No, you're right. I know a little about it. I'll tell you, you're right. The best microprocessors are Taiwanese. China doesn't have such microprocessors. For a kettle, yes, but for some nanomachine, of course not. You're right.
Because China has always developed in its own special way. Not a third way, but its unique path. By acquiring, let's say, technologies, well, let's put it this way, by manufacturing American technologies for Apple and Samsung within its own territory using cheap labor. And after that, as you said, it converts all of this into its own technologies. However, we cannot really foresee the future since we simply lack the ability to do so. But I suspect that in some 20 or 30 years, just as China mastered the making of its own kettles, it will also master making its own microprocessors. This is because its economy is currently, well, advancing by leaps and bounds, one might say.
Well, as I said, their economy is actually about to enter a decline. Well, it's already declining. There, but you're right, no one is stopping them. That's excellent. For me, I've simply arrived at the concept that nowadays there's just no escaping natural selection and no escaping capitalism. However, if definitive rules are implemented for everyone to adhere to, it would remain a competitive game, but at least it would be an equitable one. This means we'll understand that the product entering the market truly is the best one. Yes, it certainly nullifies the potential for other products to progress, but at the very least it maintains a sense of fairness. But when a product is introduced, for instance, through artificial suppression, or how does such an archaic practice as land grabbing actually occur? Rules are broken unnaturally, so what am I getting at with all of this? Natural selection existed in the Stone Age, and natural selection also exists on the New York Stock Exchange. But competing economically is still better than engaging in primitive conflict. And that's precisely why the world is aiding Ukraine, because it doesn't wish to return to a state where competition involves cannons, tanks, and, shall we say, engaging in primitive conflict. However, competition will always exist.
Yeah, competition involving guns and primitive weapons won't disappear, especially within capitalism. But in my opinion, what was the point I was trying to make? What you're trying to convey is that, to put it simply, and in line with Marxist theory, the economy of a nation ultimately undergoes monopolization. This is because, quite frankly, it's a logical progression. If I, for example, own a company, and then there's a company belonging to my partner or even my competitor, I beat him, I devoured him because, well, I won the competition. Then some new kid shows up. I'm fully aware that if he starts doing better than me, he could probably even overtake me. So I go and devour him too. And that's why the economy works on the principle of monopolization. We saw this monopolization clearly during the Great Depression, for instance, with the American company. The most significant scandal in American economic history involved Standard Oil, or what was it called at that time? Yes, Standard Oil. Yes, that's right. Standard Oil, when it was, literally by employing cannons and tanks, or rather, let's say not cannons and tanks, but the full force of the US government, was intentionally fragmented into numerous smaller entities. Even though it was quite unjust, because you see, the government needed to dismantle that monopoly, yet what is our current situation? What we're seeing now is that even though this monopoly was, so to speak, broken up, it still persists. It simply continues to exist in a different guise. Standard Oil essentially just installed their own personnel into leadership positions within these new companies. And the Great Depression as such was resolved, well, one could say, partly due to investments in the Soviet Union and the remaining territories of Germany and Great Britain. But Standard Oil never truly disappeared. If I'm not wrong, it might even still be...
No, you're absolutely right. Yes, you are quite right.
That's precisely why, yes, I'm getting to the point that seeing this utterly intractable, this capitalist issue, one might say, this fundamental problem, or rather, this dispute, I just recalled the right word. Seeing this intractable dispute, I just wonder, how can it be resolved? The only viable solution, as I perceive it, is to transfer governance entirely into the hands of the state. That doesn't mean that it has to be a state, that it's a complete monopolization. But nevertheless, if the state were to be governed on the principles of socialism, in theory, something could come of it, like what happened in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, even though there was no competition, still, regarding perhaps consumer goods, specifically jeans and pants, oh my goodness, pants. Jeans, let's say, for jeans and consumer goods, the Soviet Union was in a tight spot. Nevertheless, regarding other indicators, specifically the feeling of security about one's future, as we might call it, the Soviet experience was notably different. One could argue that the Soviet experience was rather advantageous. It certainly wasn't ideal, clearly, because if it had been, it never would have fallen apart. However, it's one of those experiences that I believe our future generations will examine and ultimately realize that the singular method to overcome this inherent contradiction, specifically concerning monopolies, will be to completely centralize and monopolize the entirety of the economy under the direct control of the state, a state that, crucially, must operate on fundamentally distinct principles from those we observe today.
Well, look, let's start from the end. You put it perfectly. And now we've come full circle back to the beginning of our conversation. History must be examined to comprehend what actions should be taken going forward. If all these elements which were inherent in the Soviet Union ultimately led to its downfall, then it suggests that while it might appear favorable tactically and in the short run, when viewed as a comprehensive long-term strategic framework, the outcome is always unfavorable. Regarding the monopoly, yes, that is precisely how a monopoly exists. Why search any further? When Apple notices a company entering the market that poses a competitive threat in a particular sector, for instance, with some rival software, they simply acquire it. Well, in the past they would come and destroy them, but now they buy them and might not even use their technology, just disband them. So yes, when there's competition, in a competition there's always a winner and a loser. When there is a winner, it turns out that somewhere, well, the principle of playoffs emerges, correct? Like in sports, a playoff. Someone will always be at the top. The one at the top is the monopolist, which is what you meant. Monopoly is bad, and we must address it. These are the direct consequences of capitalism, of natural selection. However, I would like to dispute that point. From my point of view, it is preferable to have a monopoly among commercial companies so that the government can act as a regulator over them, rather than the government itself being the monopolist with no authority above it to regulate it. And international law has no regulators within itself. The regulatory factor in international law is reputation. But to have a direct impact, well, you know, like Czechia states, Russia, you invaded Ukraine, so we cease trade with you. However, the Czech Republic cannot compel Russia to do anything. Therefore, when we have monopolistic companies, the state is still able to exert its influence over them. When the government becomes a monopoly, no one is able to manage it. The Soviet Union operated under a planned economy, and its economic system is significantly overrated. When you have no incentive to do better than someone else, you won't create anything of value. And the Soviet Union had no innovative or advanced technologies whatsoever. And those things, well, they existed, yes, some did. But it all came about in spite of, not because of the system. It was...
Okay, fine, sorry.
Well, for instance, consider the participants of the Manhattan Project. You know, those individuals. These are people like, or engineers. Korolev, for example. He's Ukrainian, by the way. He was the one doing it. He was involved in all of this because he was very passionate about it. Simply put, he did it for science. He wasn't doing it, let's say, for the Soviet Union to triumph over someone or something. For instance, he was doing it in spite of, not because of the system, so... The problem is that someone earning 120 rubles, compared to a janitor who earns 80, or an engineer in a research bureau who also gets 120, lacks any real incentive to truly exert themselves. Those who made discoveries for 120 rubles did so in spite of, not because of the system. They were natural talents, unique individuals. The country didn't stimulate them to do this because they simply loved it. Like artists or some creators, those who have the ability to create. And that's truly cool. I find it cool that a genuine creator is an artist, or how would you say it in Russian? You know, someone who creates, who originates. A creator, yes, exactly. He considers himself a mere instrument, viewing his creations as the ultimate objective. And he values his work more than his own life. There you go. Like, for example, our hero Vasil Stus, a poet and writer. He fought the regime even when his struggle yielded no results. He simply endured a very difficult life, but he went down in history as a legend. These are truly unique individuals, people in the same vein as Jesus Christ who, in spite of everything, bring something new to the world. I mean, Jesus Christ did exist, but let's remember the conditions he appeared under. You know, just imagine, whether you believe it or not, the legend goes like this, write that in. In Israel, a region then under Roman occupation, to put it in contemporary terms, where Jewish people faced intense persecution, a new doctrine emerged. So we can't say that it appeared because of the Roman Empire and that it was stimulated by it, but...
I understand your point, but we'll get sidetracked. We've gone all the way to Jerusalem, I get it. Well, you see, first of all, I truly dislike the phrase "in spite of" and similar expressions because, especially in our situation, there's a certain, how shall I put it? The myth is that the Soviet Union, the Soviet people, defeated Nazi Germany in spite of, not because of the Soviet regime. But that's a different discussion. But let's say if we assume that, and first of all, the primary principle of socialism is from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. This does not imply equalization. Even Vladimir Ilyich Lenin back in 1918 was criticized by the Mensheviks for supposedly wanting to implement complete equalization. Even he stated back then that we are not going to equalize everyone. Instead, we are going to provide each individual with what they truly merit. This is somewhat, you could call it social. Well, not social democracy, though one could argue it's a social democratic principle. Nevertheless, concerning what you mentioned about a janitor earning 80 rubles while a scientist earns 120, from my perspective, first and foremost, that's a rather bold declaration. I highly doubt that Korolev was earning 120 rubles while a janitor was earning 80. Nevertheless, even if we were to assume that everyone receives more or less an identical salary, and you see, you yourself said that people make discoveries, do good deeds, or paint, not because they need money, but because they live for it. It's their passion. I get that right?
Yes, but these are individual exceptions. We should aim to inspire 100 people, yet we fail to do so. Instead, we rely on the slim hope that just one individual, fueled by their somewhat eccentric idealistic aspirations, will succeed against all odds. But capitalism, it incentivizes all 100 people. We're discussing what you're saying. This is what I started with about anarchism. It sounds great on paper, but how do you implement it in practice? First of all, well, in the Soviet Union, there was no public ownership, there was state ownership. Not public, but state-owned.
I want to get to that point right now because for many, the Soviet Union is seen as a monolithic state that just came into being in 22 and then collapsed in 91. In my opinion, that's a very a superficial view because the Soviet Union had vastly different economic policies throughout its entire period. War communism during the Civil War was one such policy. The new economic policy was a second policy. This was followed by the policy of collectivization and industrialization, a period when people were, so to speak, truly leveled out. This was due to the immediate need for short-term concentrated efforts from the entire state to secure victory in the impending war. But our Soviet Union, following the development of the atomic bomb and after World War II, it started to undergo transformations. Now, let's not argue about whether it was changing for the better or for the worse. But those very factory cartels began to be implemented. Perhaps you've heard of them. This is essentially when we have a factory, and within that factory, there's a particular collective of workers who distribute the earnings that the factory generated amongst themselves. For example, Vasya and Petya might have made hypothetically 2 machines, but Vasya Papkin made 10 machines. He would then be paid more. Not significantly more than the remaining 2, naturally, but he would still be able to acquire something greater, something of higher value there. Well, basically, yes. So elements of competition were actually introduced even in the Soviet Union, especially during the 80s. Perestroika itself was initiated under the banner of democratization, or rather not libertarianization, but specifically democratization. And 2 others, I forget what.
No, but you see,
the core essence was to introduce competition into the planned economy, specifically to integrate competition within the framework of a planned economy.
Yep.
A small amount, precisely right at the level of, one might say, the workers, so to speak.
Units of power.
Yes, because it
of the same capacity, yes.
Yes, to create competition between them, because one could even explain why many plans were exceeded in the early days of the Soviet Union's existence. This is because people were ideologically motivated and they weren't working for financial gain. Instead, they held on to the hope that their grandchildren would one day experience a completely different world. They lived in extremely harsh conditions, yet they worked tirelessly, even 10 hours a day, solely for the purpose of, well, not for a little money, not for a loaf of bread, but you could say for the sake of an idea. This became an impossibility. Consequently, they began to introduce competition, which naturally did bring about some rather negative consequences to a certain degree. It was simply fundamentally incorrect. Well, that Kosygin reform, for one, was probably not fully implemented, like we love to do here in Russia. In Russia, nothing might change for 300 years, but then in 10, absolutely everything transforms. And it was similar, one might say, with the Kosygin reform and the economic liberalization of the Soviet Union, although that even sounds very much like.
No, well, you just have to understand that for me, that's precisely why I'm attempting to delve into the processes that constitute these very concepts. Because the concepts themselves on paper convey only one idea, something I have never grasped and still don't comprehend. Well, based on what I heard you express, I can fundamentally agree with you. To me, it simply sounds like this. A Zhiguli, by itself, won't go anywhere. But if you put an Audi engine in it, along with Mercedes wheels and a BMW chassis, then it will definitely go. I agree. And for me, the very notion of social democracy, I've never grasped what it truly means. Let's consider your idea that we need to have a state monopoly. The real question is, who exactly will be in charge? Who will serve as the representatives? And who will be people's representatives in power? Democracy, social democracy, that's elections. Elections are competition, and competition is natural selection. So it turns out that the monopoly in our idealistic state will be run by a person who gets there through competition. And right there, you have another side effect. I mean, people often don't grasp this idea that a politician who conducts a good election campaign is skilled at effective competition and winning in that race, but that's not a guarantee that they're a good manager. So,
yeah, that's true.
If again, Jesus Christ was sent down to us from heaven and they said, this is a flawless, absolutely ideal person, I would trust him. There would be a state monopoly and I would also gladly go to work. However, if I understand that the Bolsheviks seized this power by force, or if it's simply not functional, then by all means, let's hold elections. If we hold elections, how can we guarantee that a good, Jesus Christ-like figure will come to power? The one who comes to power, and that individual might already be mismanaging the state monopoly quite badly. However, with a state monopoly firmly under their control, there will be no alternative, and everything will ultimately unfold precisely as they envision. And we are only left with the hope that something positive will arrive. But how? A person who will have a positive influence on the country, but that's not a given. And again, just because an individual excels at winning competitive games, it's not a certainty that they are also a proficient manager, and we will find ourselves with something that